Following up on our discussion about collective security, it's worth talking about another way in which the UN Security Council and international organizations in particular have worked to stabilize conflict and stabilize the international system, and that's to focus on peacekeeping. So in talking about peacekeeping, it's useful to differentiate between old peacekeeping, which was common during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were sort of at loggerheads and it was really difficult to get anything through the Security Council at all, versus new peacekeeping, which was initiated in the early 1990s following a report by Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the Secretary General of the United Nations. The report was called An Agenda for Peace, in which he said, look, during the Cold War, we were really limited in what we could do. But now that the Cold War is over, there's a whole bunch of conflicts that are breaking out. There's something like 50 new conflicts that occurred in the 5 or 6 years following the end of the Cold War. The United Nations can play a really important, robust role in addressing these conflicts. And so we see a shift in how peacekeeping operates in the international system. So the old approach, the Cold War approach to peacekeeping, which we still use to some extent, was primarily there as a monitoring mechanism, right? A peace agreement is in place, the fighting has stopped, and an international force arrives, and their job is just to monitor. All the parties accept the peace agreement. All parties accept the UN or international peacekeepers, and the peacekeepers show up in small numbers, and they're not armed, and their job isn't to use force or to enforce anything. Their job is to basically hang out. And so the idea would be that they get up in the morning and they hop in a Jeep and they're armed with maybe binoculars and a radio, and they drive, up along the border, the demilitarized zone, and they look this way and they look that way, and then they report on the radio that nobody is invading anybody today, and then they go back to the barracks and they play checkers or whatever for a couple hours, and they go and do it again. And the idea is you just make sure that the peace is holding, and if the peace is breaking down, you radio back in and tell the folks in New York at the United Nations building that the war has started up again, and we think it's this side that's invading, their adversary, and so it's clear who's doing the breaking of the peace agreement. So that was the old model. New peacekeeping is this idea that the international forces are going to play an actual role in supporting a peace agreement, which means when UN forces show up, the peace might not actually be in place. There might be a ceasefire, there might be productive negotiations, but things could still be really volatile. In fact, there might not be any peace at all on the ground when peacekeepers show up. Once they're there, they're going to be taking military action to support that peace agreement, whether it's to confront violations, or whether it's to protect civilians, or any number of different activities to try to end a conflict. And that means that peacekeeping forces need to be there in fairly large numbers. In the Democratic Republic of Congo right now, the United Nations has a peacekeeping force of about 40,000 peacekeepers, so a significant military presence. They need to be there in large numbers, they need to be relatively well armed, and they need to be supported with transport vehicles, with logistic systems, with communication systems, with medical systems, to be able to make that force function in a coherent way, in a combat setting. So within peacekeeping, we can differentiate a little bit further. We can break it down not just between old and new, but between maybe different types of peacekeeping. So there's sort of traditional peacekeeping where your job is to create just a neutral barrier. You're there to monitor things, and that's it. Traditional old-style peacekeeping takes 20 folks, a radio, and a Jeep. Peace enforcement is where there's a peace agreement in place, but it's fledgling. There's worry that it could break out again. It might be that there's issues with demobilization, there's movement of forces as they're separating from each other, and the United Nations forces are there as not just a barrier, but also to facilitate that process, right? To help move troops safely to their barracks, or to oversee demobilization or turning in of weaponry. Maybe it's there to investigate if there is an attack, to check in and see, was this planned, was this intentional, or was this a bar fight that escalated and got out of control, right? And so they're there in large enough numbers to help to create a little bit of security for people who are trying to end the conflict and implement a peace agreement. And then finally, there's peacemaking, and that's where the UN peacekeeping force goes in to essentially create peace on the ground, right? The conflict participants are still at war with each other. It's a volatile situation, and the idea is that you're going to create safe zones, maybe that civilians can move to, You're going to create a military presence that essentially forces the parties apart or forces them to the bargaining table. Or maybe you have a militant force that's springing up, and in the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, UN peacekeeping forces actually waged a war against a resurgent militant group and defeated it, retaking territory. So when peace doesn't exist and you're sending peacekeepers into the middle of that, the idea is that they're going to hopefully play a positive role in making peace. That's the goal. There are some real problems and concerns with peacekeeping as it's implemented and as it plays out. And so one of the critiques of new peacekeeping is that in order to get this through, right, in order for it to pass through the Security Council, peacekeeping often assumes assumes a neutral posture. We're not calling out a particular aggressor. We're not choosing sides. It's a neutral force that's there to help everything sort of smooth out. Well, that works fine if it's a situation where both sides want the conflict to end. But if you're in a situation where one side is the aggressor, where one side wants to continue pressing the fight, peacekeepers are essentially going in with political blinders on to the reality of the situation. Furthermore, when you interject a peacekeeping force in the middle of a conflict, you're essentially freezing events on the ground, and you may freeze them on the ground in an unstable way. And so we saw this in Bosnia, where UN peacekeepers went in to create safe zones for civilians, but those safe zones were well behind Serb lines in Bosnia, and the Serbs were conducting campaigns of ethnic cleansing, driving out the Bosnian Muslims, driving out the Croats, and yet here are these pockets that the UN is keeping safe. And as soon as the UN steps aside or stops protecting those civilians, as we saw in Srebrenica, the Serbs were able to move in and slaughter the civilian population. And so that's maybe not the best scenario, in that you're sort of forced to hold an unstable front for a protracted period of time. And there's also an argument that peacekeeping is not the appropriate solution to some conflicts. Maybe the appropriate solution is to pick a side. Maybe the appropriate solution is to help one side win, and win quickly, and to end the violence in a way that creates a more stable situation on the ground, rather than locking two armed forces in place that are undefeated and still highly suspicious and highly hostile. Beyond that, we run into the problem of peacekeepers being maybe not always up to the task of what they're asked to do. And so we've seen a number of really cataclysmic events, and some of that we can attribute to the UN peacekeepers, and some of that we can attribute to the UN peacekeeping system. And so I would point out that peacekeepers are oftentimes not the best trained, they're not necessarily equipped with equipment that they're familiar with, and they're not always able to operate coherently as a military force. They have limited military capacity. The discipline and accountability, we've seen atrocities, for lack of a better word, in the past. We've seen food supplies being sold off to civilian populations in exchange for sex by peacekeepers. We've seen torture of children by peacekeepers in Haiti. We've seen really awful abuses that are a function of a less than professional, less than disciplined peacekeeping system. But we've also seen a lack of political will. And so one of the events that I think gets a lot of attention in discussing peacekeeping is the 1994 Rwandan genocide. So just a little bit of backstory on this. There was a civil war in Rwanda between the Hutus, who controlled the Rwandan government, and the Tutsis, which was another ethnic group that was based in Uganda. And in 1994, there was a peace agreement between these two groups, and UN peacekeepers were sent in to do traditional peacekeeping, a fairly small force that was brought in. The peace agreement is in place. They're there to just monitor and check it out. In about April of 1994, the Rwandan government, led by the Hutus, and particularly the military, initiate a genocide of Tutsis within Rwanda. The UN peacekeeping force suffers casualties, and the word is communicated back to New York that the peace is breaking down, and that there's a genocide going on, and that they can stop it if they just get troops sent in, if they get reinforcements. And at the UN Security Council, they debate and they discuss, and they ultimately conclude, your job is done. You have completed your mission and reporting to us. Please get out. And you have civilians who are fleeing to these UN posts seeking protection, and the UN force has to withdraw, leaving them to be butchered and slaughtered. Meanwhile, the Tutsi military in Uganda is racing across the country, trying its best to take the capital and stop the genocide, all while the United Nations is playing a less than effective role of withdrawing forces, much to the frustration of the commander and much to the frustration of the international community in hindsight that this genocide was allowed to just continue. From the perspective of old peacekeeping, the peacekeepers accomplished their mission. Their job was to report. They reported. The solution is to be found in the political process and how the Security Council responds. From the perspective of new peacekeeping, if the mission had been peace enforcement, if they had responded with that as their mission, if they had been supported in that, a genocide that claimed 700,000 plus people very well could have been prevented.